The relief of Bastogne did not register in Berlin as a local tactical reversal. It landed as a strategic discontinuity that invalidated the operating assumptions behind the entire Ardennes offensive. Until that moment, German planners had treated the encirclement as a fixed condition, a sealed pocket whose reduction was a matter of time and artillery. Intelligence summaries framed Bastogne as isolated, undersupplied, and operationally inert. The expectation was not immediate collapse, but functional paralysis, an American force present on maps but absent from maneuver calculations. That assumption shaped German traffic control, fuel allocation, and the sequencing of armored thrusts toward the Meuse. Bastogne in that model was noise, not friction. The context in which this belief formed is critical. By late December 1944, German command culture was operating under acute compression. Communications were degraded, reserves were theoretical, and the offensive itself was a wager against arithmetic. Every hour mattered, and so did every road junction. Bastogne's value lay not in its garrison but in its geography. It was the nodal point through which multiple hard-surface routes converged. German formations understood this in theory but discounted it in practice because the town was assumed to be functionally neutralized. Reports from the front reinforced this bias, emphasizing American shortages and overstating German containment. What was missing was an appreciation of American operational elasticity, the capacity to generate combat power faster than German estimates allowed. The progression from assumption to shock unfolded with speed. When armored elements from the south broke through and re-established ground contact, the event itself was tactically modest but operationally catastrophic. The encirclement was not simply pierced, it was disproven. German units that had been maneuvering under the premise of a closed pocket suddenly faced an active, supplied, and expanding American force astride their rear area routes. Timetables collapsed immediately. Columns already short on fuel were forced into detours, halts, and defensive postures for which they had not been resourced. Traffic control points designed for forward movement became choke points under threat. The offensive, already behind schedule, lost the margin it could not afford to lose. The climax of the shock lay less in the physical relief than in what it revealed about the enemy. The rapidity with which American forces coordinated air-ground resupply, armored relief, and perimeter defense contradicted German intelligence estimates at every level. Bastogne demonstrated that American command systems could absorb disruption and still synchronize complex operations under winter conditions. This was not merely resilience, it was tempo generation. German planners had assumed that logistics governed American action. Bastogne showed that American logistics could be reconstituted faster than German maneuver could exploit scarcity. The realization forced an unplanned cognitive shift. The opponent was not reacting to German moves but reasserting initiative inside the German decision cycle. The resolution of this shock was not adaptation but paralysis. There was no reserve to re-encircle Bastogne decisively, no fuel to redirect armored divisions without collapsing other sectors, and no time to rebuild a coherent operational picture. Orders became increasingly aspirational, disconnected from the physical state of units on the ground. The relief of Bastogne crystallized the broader failure of the Ardennes offensive by exposing its central vulnerability. It relied on static assumptions about a dynamic enemy. From that point forward, German operations in the Ardennes were no longer advancing toward an objective but managing the consequences of a misjudgment. Bastogne ceased to be a town on the map and became evidence that the offensive had already lost its strategic coherence, even if the fighting had not yet caught up to that fact. The first reports of Third Army movement north did not produce alarm so much as rejection. In German headquarters, the idea that a large American armored force could disengage from active operations, pivot 90 degrees, and re-enter the fight on a different axis in winter conditions conflicted with deeply held assessments of American command rigidity. Early signals traffic was treated as misinterpretation or exaggeration, localized probes mistaken for operational redeployment. Staff officers annotated situation maps cautiously, often in pencil, waiting for confirmation that fit existing expectations. The initial reaction was not disbelief in American capability, but confidence that such a maneuver, if attempted, would be slow, fragmented, and operationally irrelevant. That confidence was grounded in context that, on paper, appeared reasonable. German intelligence had tracked Third Army as logistically extended, committed eastward, and constrained by weather. Road conditions were assumed to be limiting, fuel availability decisive, and American command processes procedural rather than adaptive. German planning models emphasized linear causality. Disengagement created vulnerability, redeployment consumed time, and winter imposed universal friction. These assumptions had worked against other opponents. They shaped the belief that any American response to the Ardennes offensive would arrive late, diluted, and reactive. The notion of synchronized corps-level movement executed on compressed timelines was dismissed as theoretically possible but practically unattainable. As reports accumulated, the progression from skepticism to concern unfolded unevenly. Field commanders began reporting increased American pressure along secondary roads and unexpected contact from units identified as belonging to Third Army. These were initially rationalized as reconnaissance elements or ad hoc task forces. High command communications reveal a lag between field observation and institutional acknowledgement. The reporting chain filtered information through expectation, delaying recalibration. Orders issued during this period continued to assume that southern approaches to Bastogne were secure enough to be managed by thin screening forces. Operational directives emphasized maintaining forward momentum elsewhere, implicitly betting that American movement lacked the mass to matter. The turning point came when timing data could no longer be reconciled. Movement rates exceeded German estimates by a factor that invalidated prior calculations. Units expected to require days appeared in hours. Road junctions thought to be beyond immediate reach came under pressure almost simultaneously. This was not merely speed, it was coordination. The realization that American command had pre-planned contingency movement, complete with fuel dumps, traffic control, and command and control continuity, forced a reassessment. The maneuver was not improvised at the tactical level. It was executed as an operational decision already integrated into American planning culture. At that moment, Patton ceased to be perceived as an aggressive subordinate and emerged as an independent operational actor capable of disrupting German sequencing. The climax of German reaction was marked by internal contradiction rather than decisive response. Some staff elements urged immediate countermeasures, redeploy reserves, reinforce southern blocking positions, or adjust priorities to contain the threat. Others argued that reacting would only compound existing delays and that the maneuver would culminate short of decisive effect. This debate unfolded under conditions of shrinking time and incomplete information. No option was clean, and all assumed resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantity. The absence of a unified reaction reflected not confusion but structural limitation. German command could recognize the problem faster than it could generate a solution. Resolution arrived quietly, without formal acknowledgement. Orders began to reflect defensive language where offensive intent had dominated days earlier. References to American rigidity disappeared from staff commentary, replaced by cautionary notes about enemy flexibility and tempo. The maneuver forced a recalibration of how the opponent was understood, but it did so too late to restore coherence. Patton's movement north did not merely threaten a sector, it exposed a flaw in German operational judgment. The High Command's initial reactions, dismissive, delayed, and divided, became part of the outcome. What had been assumed impossible was now operational fact, and German decision-making shifted from shaping events to accommodating them, constrained by a reality it had been slow to accept. Behind the formal communiques and sanitized situation reports, a different evaluation was taking shape in private notes, margin annotations, and post-action memoranda exchanged among German senior commanders. Removed from the need to maintain institutional confidence, these assessments confronted a problem that official language avoided. The enemy was moving faster and with greater internal coherence than German doctrine had accounted for. The issue was not bravery or numbers, but tempo, specifically the ability to synchronize movement, supply, and command across dispersed formations under adverse conditions. What unsettled these officers was not that the Americans had advanced, but that they had done so without the expected pauses, breakdowns, or visible seams. The context for these private judgments lay in the professional habits of the German officer corps. Trained to think in terms of operational art, they were acutely sensitive to the relationship between time, space, and force. Many had built careers on exploiting enemy dislocation, assuming that complex movements inevitably generated friction exploitable by a competent opponent. In this framework, speed was less impressive than coordination. Rapid advance without synchronization was self-defeating. Early assumptions held that American forces, while materially strong, lacked the staff culture to execute high-velocity, multi-axis maneuvers without losing cohesion. This belief persisted publicly even as private correspondence began to erode it. As events unfolded, progression in these assessments became visible through shifts in tone. Initial comments framed American speed as risky overextension, noting exposed flanks and presumed logistical fragility. Within days, that language hardened into something closer to professional unease. Reports emphasized how American columns arrived in correct sequence, how relief elements linked with encircled units without confusion, and how artillery and air support appeared aligned with ground movement rather than trailing it. German generals noted that orders seemed to propagate through American formations with minimal delay, suggesting a command and control architecture more resilient than previously believed. These were not emotional reactions. They were analytical recalculations grounded in observation. The critical insight emerged when German officers compared expected timelines with actual contact reports. Movement rates exceeded not only German planning assumptions but also German experience under similar conditions. Winter terrain, which should have imposed universal friction, appeared selectively restrictive, slowing German responses more than American advances. Private notes began to identify this asymmetry as systemic rather than incidental. American logistics, long regarded as cumbersome, were now recognized as adaptive, capable of sustaining momentum rather than merely supporting it. The coordination between armor, infantry, engineers, and supply was not improvised. It reflected rehearsed processes executed under pressure. The climax of these private assessments came in the recognition that German intelligence models themselves were outdated. Several generals acknowledged that they had been evaluating an earlier version of the American Army, one shaped by 1942 and 1943 experience, rather than the force that now existed. Training cycles, staff maturation, and combat learning had produced an opponent whose operational competence had converged uncomfortably close to German standards, and in some respects surpassed them in flexibility. This realization carried an implicit admission. German command advantages were no longer inherent, but conditional, and those conditions were eroding. Resolution did not take the form of doctrinal revision or immediate corrective action. There was neither time nor institutional space for that. Instead, these assessments settled into a quiet consensus that the operational balance had shifted. Speed and coordination were no longer German monopolies, and planning predicated on American sluggishness was strategically unsound. The significance of these private judgments lay in their restraint. They did not exaggerate enemy brilliance or descend into fatalism. They simply recorded, with professional clarity, that assumptions had failed under contact. By the time these conclusions solidified, their practical utility was limited. They served less as guidance for ongoing operations than as early entries in a postmortem, documenting the moment when German commanders privately acknowledged that the operational environment had changed faster than their planning culture could adapt. The change was not marked by panic or collapse, but by a subtle erosion detectable only to those accustomed to reading formations rather than proclamations. German morale did not break in the aftermath of the breakthrough. It thinned. Confidence, once assumed as a given, became conditional, recalculated against daily reports that no longer aligned with expectations. The initial tone within units remained disciplined and professional, but beneath that surface lay a growing awareness that the operational environment was no longer behaving as predicted. What unsettled the force was not defeat in the conventional sense, but the realization that control, over tempo, over initiative, over the sequence of events, was slipping incrementally out of reach. Context matters here, because German morale in late 1944 was already a managed commodity. Units entering the Ardennes had been briefed for a short, violent operation designed to restore strategic leverage, not endure prolonged uncertainty. Confidence had been manufactured through selective intelligence, rigid planning assumptions, and an emphasis on surprise as a force multiplier. As long as those assumptions appeared intact, morale remained functional even under strain. The breakthrough disrupted that equilibrium. It introduced variables that could not be easily rationalized away, enemy forces appearing where they were not scheduled to be, resistance stiffening rather than collapsing, and logistical pressures compounding instead of easing. Morale began to decouple from official intent. As days passed, the progression of this shift became evident in small but telling indicators. After-action reports grew more cautious in language, replacing certainty with qualifiers. Officers who had previously spoken in terms of inevitability began emphasizing contingencies. Requests for clarification increased, not because orders were unclear, but because confidence in their premises was eroding. At the troop level, this translated into a heightened sensitivity to rumor and an increased fixation on flanks and rear areas. The enemy was no longer framed as exhausted and reactive, but as present, mobile, and increasingly assertive. This perception altered behavior even before it altered outcomes. The psychological weight of the breakthrough lay in its asymmetry. German forces had accepted hardship as normal, attrition as expected, and resistance as manageable. What they had not prepared for was an enemy response that inverted the narrative of exhaustion. The realization that American forces could absorb shock and still generate coordinated pressure undermined one of the last remaining pillars of German confidence, the belief that Allied operational momentum was brittle. When that belief failed, it forced a reassessment of risk at every level. Commanders became more conservative in committing reserves that scarcely existed, while junior leaders hesitated less from fear than from uncertainty about the larger picture they could no longer trust. The climax of this morale shift was not a dramatic loss of will, but a pervasive narrowing of ambition. Operational goals quietly contracted. Where discipline had once been reinforced by belief in purpose, it now relied increasingly on habit and obligation. Confidence in leadership remained outwardly intact, but it was no longer reinforced by results. Soldiers continued to fight effectively, yet with a growing sense that effort was compensating for structural disadvantage rather than exploiting opportunity. This distinction mattered. It altered how losses were interpreted, how setbacks were internalized, and how endurance was justified. Resolution came in the form of emotional stabilization rather than recovery. German morale did not collapse after the breakthrough. It settled into a lower, more brittle state. Confidence became situational, tied to immediate terrain or local success rather than the broader campaign logic. The breakthrough had demonstrated that the enemy was not merely resilient but adaptive, capable of reclaiming initiative under conditions meant to deny it. That understanding imposed a psychological tax that no amount of discipline could fully offset. From that point forward, morale functioned, but it no longer propelled action. It sustained resistance without restoring belief, carrying the force forward mechanically while confidence, once assumed as an advantage, quietly receded into memory. What emerged most clearly from the event was not a single maneuver or decision, but a pattern of capability that German planning had consistently underestimated. Allied operations revealed an ability to convert uncertainty into advantage, not through improvisation alone, but through systems designed to absorb shock without losing coherence. The event exposed a force that did not rely on perfect conditions or linear execution, but on redundancy, delegation, and tempo control. What appeared sudden from the outside was the visible surface of a deeper operational maturity, one that allowed movement, supply, and command to remain synchronized even as circumstances shifted. The context for this realization lay in the contrast between expectation and outcome. German assessments had long framed Allied strength as material rather than operational, assuming that numerical and industrial advantages compensated for slower decision-making and doctrinal rigidity. This model presumed that disruption, weather, terrain, enemy action, would disproportionately degrade Allied performance. The event demonstrated the opposite. Allied formations showed an ability to reorganize under pressure, reallocating forces across sectors without paralyzing their command structure. This suggested that planning processes had anticipated friction rather than merely reacted to it, embedding flexibility into execution rather than treating it as an exception. As the situation developed, the progression of Allied actions revealed a command culture comfortable with decentralized initiative bounded by clear intent. Movement was rapid but not reckless. Coordination between ground elements, logistics, and supporting arms indicated prior rehearsal of contingency pathways. Allied staff work proved capable of compressing decision cycles, translating high-level intent into executable orders with minimal delay. Intelligence was not treated as static input but as a continuously updated variable, informing adjustments without forcing pauses. This capacity to maintain tempo while recalibrating plans challenged the assumption that large coalition forces were inherently slow to pivot. The critical insight came when it became clear that Allied logistics were not merely sustaining operations but shaping them. Supply was not trailing maneuver, it was enabling it in near real time. Fuel, ammunition, and maintenance assets appeared positioned with an understanding of likely operational shifts, allowing forward elements to exploit opportunity rather than wait for replenishment. This integration blurred the traditional distinction between planning and execution. The Allies were not choosing between speed and security. They had built a system that allowed both to coexist, at least within the operational envelope of late 1944. At the climax of these reflections was the recognition that Allied operational capability had matured beyond reactive warfare. The event demonstrated an ability to impose dilemmas rather than respond to them, forcing the opponent to confront multiple, simultaneous pressures without the means to resolve them coherently. Allied forces did not seek decisive action through a single blow, but through cumulative disruption, arriving sooner than expected, in greater strength than anticipated, and with coordination that denied easy countermeasures. This was not brilliance at the point of contact. It was competence distributed across the force. Resolution came with a sobering reassessment of what this implied for the broader balance of capability. The event revealed that Allied forces had closed, and in some areas surpassed, the operational proficiency long claimed as a German advantage. Their effectiveness lay not in any one commander or formation, but in institutional practices that translated resources into usable combat power at speed. Assumptions that Allied success depended on attrition or overwhelming force alone were no longer tenable. The event exposed an opponent capable of executing complex operations under adverse conditions with discipline, coordination, and intent. In that sense, it marked not just a tactical or operational moment, but a diagnostic one, revealing that the character of Allied warfare had evolved, and that any analysis failing to account for that evolution was already obsolete. The relief of Bastogne forced a recalibration that extended far beyond the immediate tactical picture, cutting into the foundational expectations that had underpinned the campaign itself. Until that point, German planning had been sustained by a belief that the operational arc, though compressed and risky, remained intelligible, that events would unfold within a predictable envelope of delay, attrition, and exhaustion on the Allied side. Bastogne disrupted that mental framework. It introduced evidence that the campaign was no longer unfolding according to German timing assumptions, and that corrective action was arriving not incrementally, but decisively and ahead of schedule. The context of this realization lay in how the campaign had been conceived. German expectations were structured around controlled surprise followed by managed exploitation. Even setbacks were assumed to be containable within this design, absorbed through local adjustments while the broader operational logic remained intact. Bastogne had been categorized as a problem to be fixed later, a pocket to be reduced once forward momentum had been secured. Its relief inverted that logic. The campaign was now being shaped by Allied responses rather than German initiative, and that reversal carried implications that could not be isolated to a single sector. As reports stabilized and the immediate shock receded, the progression of understanding became clearer. German headquarters began to recognize that the relief was not an anomaly but a signal. Allied forces had demonstrated an ability to intervene decisively at a point of German choosing, on a timeline that contradicted prior estimates. This meant that the campaign could no longer be treated as a race against Allied exhaustion. Instead, it had become a contest of competing operational systems, one in which German margins for error were narrower than anticipated. The expectation that Allied reactions would lag behind German moves was no longer defensible. The deeper implication lay in what this meant for future planning within the campaign's remaining scope. Bastogne's relief suggested that any apparent German advantage was provisional and vulnerable to rapid negation. Assumptions about secure flanks, delayed counteraction, and predictable Allied sequencing were exposed as optimistic at best. This forced German commanders to reconsider not only what they could achieve, but what they could realistically hold. The campaign's objectives, once framed as ambitious but attainable, began to appear increasingly abstract, dependent on conditions that no longer existed. The climax of this realization was not dramatic, but analytical. German planners confronted the fact that the campaign's internal logic had been compromised. The relief demonstrated that Allied forces possessed both the intent and the capability to disrupt German plans at critical nodes, denying the cumulative effect upon which success depended. Even if local successes could still be achieved, their strategic value was now questionable. Each gain risked being offset before it could be consolidated, eroding the campaign's coherence one intervention at a time. What made this shift particularly damaging was its timing. The campaign had little elasticity left. Fuel, reserves, and operational flexibility were already constrained, leaving minimal capacity to respond to a more dynamic enemy. Bastogne's relief thus functioned as a diagnostic moment, revealing that the campaign's assumptions had been overtaken by reality. It was no longer possible to believe that time favored German objectives, or that Allied intervention could be delayed long enough to force a favorable decision. Resolution came in the form of lowered expectations, though rarely articulated openly. Planning language became more cautious, increasingly focused on stabilization rather than exploitation. The campaign was no longer viewed as a decisive instrument capable of reshaping the strategic situation, but as a struggle to manage deterioration under pressure. Bastogne's relief had altered how German commanders understood the trajectory of events. It exposed the campaign not as a bold gamble nearing success, but as an operation whose foundational assumptions had failed under contact. From that point forward, German expectations were shaped less by intent than by constraint, informed by the recognition that the enemy's capacity to intervene decisively had been underestimated, and that this miscalculation now defined the limits of what the campaign could achieve.